For a number of reasons, chief among them being scarcity. We did not get a Wii console until a couple years after it came out. Even after that, I can't actually remember when exactly we picked up our copy of Sonic and the Secret Rings. What I do know is that it was definitely after we got Sonic Unleashed and Sonic and the Black Knight, but probably before Sonic Colors. That is to say that Sonic and the Secret Rings would be among the last titles for the Wii that I would experience, despite it being one of the launch titles for the console. I actually remember when the game was first being promoted online. I'm inclined to believe that it was either Sonic and the Secret Rings or Mega Man Star Force that ended up being the first game I ever remember feeling real hype for. Both games were slated for a 2007 release, and while my brother and I would get Mega Man Star Force at launch, Sonic and the Secret Rings would have to wait for a while. But I remember feeling so excited to see a new next-gen Sonic game coming out. At that point, my brother and I had inadvertently managed to collect every Sonic game released for the Nintendo GameCube. And seeing how many Sonic games were coming out on Nintendo hardware, it was a no-brainer for us that the next console in our sights after the DS was the Wii. It's kind of funny, actually. I was aware that Sonic 06 was already out for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, but in my mind, because Xbox and PlayStation 2 didn't get nearly as much Sonic as the GameCube did, I kind of compartmentalized Sonic 06 in my mind as being something of a spin-off for the series, rather in contrast to Sonic and the Secret Rings, which was the real flagship title. It's really funny looking back at that, considering it's obvious it was the other way around, but that's how kids can sometimes think, right? Anyway, I remember seeing screenshots of the game, and I remember being blown away by how amazing the graphics looked. They looked far beyond anything I had been used to seeing on the GameCube. At that time, I was playing copious amounts of Sonic Heroes and Shadow the Hedgehog, and even though those games weren't really that old at the time, their distinctively renderware look was getting a little tiring to look at, especially with the shiny, low-poly character models. Weirdly, Sonic and the Secret Rings had me in awe over the look of Sonic's character model, as well as the grass that was present in the dinosaur level screenshot. It just looked so next-gen to me, and at the time, I wasn't yet aware of the power discrepancy between the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 over the Wii. Even then, however, I do feel that Sonic and the Secret Rings' art direction really helps to carry it and has led it to age quite well over the last 18 years. I would actually argue that Sonic and the Secret Rings has aged better visually than Sonic Unleashed on the Wii. I really think it's a beautiful game despite some of its performance issues later in the game, but that's besides the point. When I finally got to experience the game, I actually watched my brother play through it first, and that was when I realized a real problem. You see, despite being a full supporter of the Wii and believing in the games that came out for it, especially the exclusives, I really had trust issues with the motion control aspect of the games that came out for it. It wasn't necessarily that I ever had a terrible experience with the Wii Remote controls or anything, but that I had a hard time accepting there being no other control options for games except for the motion controls. This was mainly due to the fact that I never felt extraordinarily confident in developers' ability to implement them in the best way, and I feared that an otherwise amazing game could be rendered unplayable because the motion controls were the only control option and were poorly implemented. I was almost never disappointed with them, however, except maybe for Mario Kart Wii's controls, after having played Need for Speed Pro Street, which was so much more responsive in comparison. I just felt that for a console with a classic controller and GameCube controller ports on top, there was no excuse to at least include them as options, like so many other games did. In any event, things got worse when my brother told me about how Sonic runs forward automatically and that he has to charge up jumps, and moving backwards in a stage does not include a change in camera perspective. All of this made me skeptical of the game, and I opted to watch my brother play through the game first before I would decide if I would do the same. The first time I ever considered this for a Sonic game ever. And he ran into the Eraser Djinn boss fight and got stuck there. It was at that point I realized this game was a total mess. And for some undisclosed amount of time, I didn't touch the game even after my brother had managed to finish it. I think I probably finished Sonic Colors before finally going into Sonic and the Secret Rings for the first time myself. But I did, and at first it didn't really seem as wonky as it looked. It took some getting used to. The tutorial section was a bit drawn out, but for the most part it was fine enough. But then I got to Eraser Djinn, and again I found myself stuck just as my brother did. That was the point I realized that this game was absolute trash, the worst Sonic game ever made, and even after finishing the final boss, Alf Layla Wa Layla, I promised myself, never again. Then, on April 1st, 2024, I decided to embark on a wild journey, playing nearly every Sonic game in release order. This meant revisiting games that were the source of some painful childhood gaming trauma, like Sonic the Hedgehog 2 for Game Gear, or Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine and Sonic Spinball. By the time I had actually come around to Sonic and the Secret Rings, while I had managed to conquer my old childhood nemesis of yesteryear as far as the classic 90s era was concerned, Sonic and the Secret Rings was a game I had a pretty strong apprehension about going into. It was worse than any version of Sonic 06 I had since played, and I really couldn't fathom having the patience to navigate this game in a way that would minimize time spent on it. At first, I found myself fighting the game more than I remembered when I was a kid, starting the game for the first time. But then, as I progressed through the game, I realized that I totally misunderstood this as a kid. This game is kinda good? Fun? What? I don't know what it is, but so far in this long-term self-imposed challenge to beat every Sonic game, I've found that a lot of these games from my childhood, especially games like Sonic CD, Sonic 3 and Knuckles, Sonic Adventure 2, etc., all got better. I somehow find myself experiencing the opposite for these games, where they are better than I remember, and aside from Shadow the Hedgehog, the most shocking of these was Sonic and the Secret Rings. After playing through the game as an adult, I found that I just got it. Everything from the nature of the controls, to the level design, to the difficulty of the boss fights, especially the last two, and the missions, I get it now. Since this game is approaching 20 years old, I thought it would be interesting to explore just what Sonic and the Secret Rings does right, or at the very least, interestingly, since there are already a plethora of videos on YouTube already talking about everything wrong with it. So allow me to defend the Indefensible, and let me be the one guy who will say Sonic and the Secret Rings might have always been pretty good, actually. Sonic and the Secret Rings is a pretty long game. It's definitely one of the longer games in this series. I distinctively remember as a kid noticing how games like Sonic and the Black Knight, and even Sonic Colors to a certain extent, seemed to be getting progressively shorter. At the time, I had no real idea how to articulate how it seemed the games felt they were getting shorter, but especially with Sonic and the Black Knight, it was very noticeable. Games like Shadow the Hedgehog, Sonic and the Secret Rings, and even Sonic Adventure helped me realize how those games could feel so much longer and more substantial. Where Sonic Adventure is packed full of long cutscenes that really do a lot to fill out the game's runtime as far as story mode is concerned, games like Shadow the Hedgehog and Sonic and the Secret Rings are able to feel like substantial games thanks to their being reliant on a mission system. Of course, the way they implement their mission systems differ quite significantly. As far as Secret Rings is concerned, the mission structure operates somewhat similarly to games like Super Mario Sunshine, except one's ability to unlock the next level doesn't necessarily mean you will never have to go back to that level again. Every level presents the player with a series of possible missions they can take on, but it isn't necessary to finish every single one of them. Certain missions carry important story beats, which then move the story forward. But sometimes those missions are only unlockable by beating earlier missions, or missions present in other levels. If story progression is the only thing you are going for strictly, then you will find this means of progression very linear. Although I would advise against that, and I will explain why later. The mission structure does involve quite a bit of guesswork, and there's no really knowing what missions to do in order to strictly progress the story on a first playthrough without a guide, since the missions show no indication of which ones are plot sensitive. Personally, I don't mind this, since a lot of these missions remind me of the additional stage configurations you can play through in Sonic Adventure 2, aside from the vanilla versions of those stages. Of course, there are vanilla versions of each stage, but what is pretty cool is that it isn't always the case that the first mission of every stage will be to race to the end of it. In a way, the missions coming before the proper run can give the player a sense of the level design and somewhat of a makeshift tutorial, and it feels organic enough that it doesn't really feel like a tutorial at all. These initial missions are usually not too difficult, which is also pretty nice. These missions typically test the player's command of the game's base gameplay mechanics that are typically tied to certain moves and power-ups that Sonic acquires over the course of the game. Sometimes the way to unlock these power-ups is to earn it in a different challenge and then practice it in the prologue stage to properly unlock it. On possible repeat playthroughs, I can see this aspect of going back to the prologue stage to unlock the ability to equip a crucial new move to progress the game, especially the speed and time breaks, can be pretty tedious. And it isn't always obvious that that's how you are meant to unlock them, if you aren't exactly familiar with the game and its progression. That aside, however, I found that I liked this potential non-linear progression system. There are some challenges early on that you unlock that are clearly not immediately possible to complete with Sonic's current possible loadout. I think especially of the Uhu race in the dinosaur stage. Sonic is pretty much without any power-ups at that point, and Vanilla Sonic, at least in my experience, has not even a whisper of a chance to beat Uhu in that stage when it's unlocked. In a Metroidvania kind of way, it forces the player to go to other missions and other stages to unlock more abilities to equip Sonic to give him the skills and moveset necessary to go back and beat that challenge. Since that mission isn't a plot-sensitive one, it's not even one you have to go back to beat if you don't want to. Honestly, the fact you have that option at all is pretty cool. Sonic and the Secret Rings makes a very controversial decision at its outset that I think really gives people the wrong idea about how well the game controls. This is kind of a flaw with the game, but I find it to also be kind of cool, if not entirely in execution, but in concept. At the very beginning of the game, Sonic controls poorly. His lateral movement feels unresponsive, his jump feels heavy, and as if it has input lag, and Sonic's acceleration is the most sluggish it would ever be until Sonic the Hedgehog 4, Episode 1. I feel as though a lot of people get this first impression and immediately write the game off after entering the first level, realizing that this control scheme is just not working out. While obviously there are better ways to execute this kind of game design, I really like this sentiment, and overall, I can't really complain too much about it as a result. At least, I guess I can tolerate it because I know what is possible when you give the game and its character progression system time to express itself. Sonic and the Secret Rings has what I would call an RPG-lite system that kind of behaves as baby's first RPG system. When I was a kid, RPG systems really overwhelmed me because I really didn't want to think about stuff like that. But one of the advantages of Sonic and the Secret Rings system is that it is so easy to manage that even I, as a kid, was able to manage it no problem. This might mean that for veterans of games with RPG-style character progression, this might be such a shallow system that it might as well not really exist, and I can't really argue against that. But if you don't think too much about it, it's actually pretty neat. In the beginning, Sonic controls pretty poorly. He's a bit slow to get up to speed and is generally not as responsive as one might like for a Sonic game. However, the level designs early in the game do compensate for this. In a way, I feel it helps the player to get acclimated with the controls in general so that as they progress through the game and Sonic becomes more capable, players will have an easier time navigating the stages at higher speeds. Sonic and the Secret Rings has a progression system where the better Sonic performs in a given mission, he will be awarded points and scrolls. Scrolls consist of new moves and abilities for Sonic to help expand his moveset and grant him certain perks to help improve his ability to navigate obstacles and stage hazards. The points you are awarded upon completing stages basically act as experience points that level up Sonic. The higher Sonic's level reaches, the more power-ups Sonic will be allowed to equip. Sonic and the Secret Rings offers 4 different rings Sonic can equip, and these rings can all include their own individual power-up loadouts and can be customized by the player to fit certain mission scenarios. These power-ups typically offer passive perks that make your quality of life within the game much better as you continue unlocking them. This can be anything from tighter handling, a boost at the beginning of the stage after the countdown eliminating Sonic's need to get up to speed, and giving Sonic's Stomp an area of effect ability to damage adjacent enemies. This gives players a lot of potential combinations of power-up configurations they can equip Sonic with, but it might seem a little unnecessarily excessive. It's very easy to earn several skill scrolls at a time, and the points you earn upon completing levels successfully are plentiful. As a result, it becomes very easy to simply equip as many power-ups as you want to just one ring, because you can then stack it with all the best ones as you level up Sonic through the game. Part of me wants to see how Sonic behaves with his stats all maxed out, or to see if it's even possible to equip every power-up in a single ring. All the more reason to revisit the game. But as Sonic's power and abilities increase, the difficulty of the levels do as well somewhat. One of the interesting things about this RPG-like system is that because of the controls and overall feel of the game being a bit numb in the beginning and leveling up and improving over the course of the game, you kind of start the game out on hard mode, and interacting with the game gets progressively easier as you unlock more abilities that improve your overall quality of life. In this way, then, you are kind of forced to get good from the beginning and earn the ability to do what you came to the game expecting to do from the outset. For some, this can be so off-putting that players will quit before they get anywhere close to unlocking Sonic's fullest potential. For someone like me, this can be something of a reward. You are thrown into the deep end with handicaps and are forced to make do with what little you do have to unlock the ability to do more in future missions and even in previous ones. This kind of messes with the game's difficulty curve, since depending on how much you grind the earlier missions, later levels could potentially become a bit of a breeze, but it has its own feeling of satisfaction it brings in its own way, in the same way as going back to get the S ranks in previous levels in Sonic Unleashed once you've collected all the level up items in the HD version. I know for any of those who may or may not have seen my Sonic Unleashed So Great I Bought It Twice video are probably yelling at me right now about how what I'm praising Sonic and the Secret Rings for is exactly what I criticized the HD version of Sonic Unleashed for when it came to Sonic lacking all his movement abilities from the beginning. Honestly, I do feel that I should probably make a follow-up video to that one, since upon revisiting it, I really came off as a bit too negative than I actually intended to about Sonic Unleashed as a whole. But I guess if I were to illustrate what is different in Secret Rings compared to Unleashed, I would probably say its implementation in Secret Rings is tied directly to the main gameplay as opposed to being locked behind a number of collectibles and only found in a hub world. I'm not sure if my current self would be particularly moved by that anymore, but that's probably the argument my past self would have made in defense of Secret Rings. Take that for what you will, and in the future, I hope to make a video amending some of the points I made in my original Sonic Unleashed video. But back to Sonic and the Secret Rings. In recent years, I've really grown not to mind games and gameplay loops that offer a higher level of challenge. Sonic and the Secret Rings bosses are such a case. Because the game forces you to interact with its motion controls, there is a certain added physicality that comes with the game's combat than you would otherwise get from simpler button presses. And thanks to all the different ways the Wii Remote can be moved in combination with certain button presses, the boss fights can have a certain level of variety that require a greater degree of real-life skill and reaction time than what might be required for some simpler button prompts. Timing is especially of high importance in these scenarios, since a lot of the time, not only does it take more time to do the input in real life, but there is also a degree of wind-up in the game itself. There are a number of different timing factors that must be taken into account in order to be successful in the levels, and especially the bosses. It reminds me of something like AI Limit, a game which I have been playing through recently in my own time. A lot of Souls-like games have the time lag between input and attack via animation as a main feature of their gameplay. It adds to the strategy and really tests the player's ability to feel the rhythm of the combat and respond accordingly to their preferred combat style. While of course Sonic is far from anything even remotely related to being a Souls-like series, Sonic and the Secret Rings control characteristics offer a similar experience, at least as far as platformers are concerned. Sonic's jump especially takes time to wind up, and while this can be sped up eventually using a skill scroll you can unlock later in the game, even his short, quick jump isn't as instantaneous as it was in previous Sonic games. Even still, he doesn't roll into a ball when he jumps either, leaving him vulnerable to enemy attacks in a way he wasn't in previous games. I guess except for Sonic 06, but that is a slightly different situation. Everything takes at least a little time to spool up thanks to the motion controls, but the game is very much designed around this fact. So really, it is more of a matter of players' abilities to work around this system rather than a flaw. The most telling combat scenario this comes into play with is the Eraser Jin fight at the end of the main story before the final story. This fight contains a number of challenges that test your ability to predict attack patterns, your knowledge of where you should be to best avoid those attack patterns, and your timing with jumping, homing attack, and use of Sonic's time break. Eraser Jin can actually be damaged in two different ways in this boss fight, offering the player a level of flexibility which wouldn't necessarily be much of a feature moving forward to future Sonic games of that generation for the most part, though there are some exceptions. The first opportunity you get is when he is doing his regular attacks at you. When he does one of the more complex patterns, which force him to bring his face down closer to Sonic's level, you can jump and homing attack his face up to 3 times before his next attack pattern happens. The other attack he has is when he stops moving and charges you after some interval of time. This is where the time break becomes essential, since he moves far too quickly in real time to react unless you have somehow memorized the timing of when he will charge Sonic. For everyone else, time break is a great way to buy yourself those much needed seconds of reaction time, but the timing of your attack is still very important. Upon replaying this boss, I realized that the best timing for the homing attack input is the moment the green target reticle appears. Because of the added lag thanks to the slowed flow of time from the time break, there is a long stretch where Sonic builds up the homing attack. That windup takes about as much time as it takes for the target reticle to switch from green to red, and since Sonic doesn't attack until after it turns red, the game reads the homing attack as having been input after the reticle turned red, and thus a hit. For the longest time as a kid, I would wait until the reticle would turn red until inputting the homing attack, but it would fail more often than not. Maybe it sounds a bit ridiculous, but I couldn't help but to feel as though I had finally perfected something that had haunted me so much as a kid, to the point of near trivialization. There's something cathartic about that, and maybe that's part of the reason why my opinion about the game has turned the way it did. The final boss, I also felt, was another test of player skill and strategy that I really haven't seen in any other Wii game, or any game since for that matter. It is as much a test of the player's skill as it is a test of the player's real-life physical stamina. The time end or speed break gauge on the right needs to be charged, and the only way to charge it is by shaking the Wii remote. As long as the gauge is in the orange range, it should be okay, but the higher you are able to charge the gauge, the better. This is all while avoiding Alflayla Walayla's various attacks, which increase in speed and intensity as you damage him. His HP is visualized by the points on his body where the world rings entered. They are emitting some kind of steam, and when you damage them, they stop. When he throws his giant spirit bomb at you, you use the speed break to charge at it. You are then prompted to shake the Wii Remote to slow or even reverse the depletion of your speed break gauge. Once you throw it back to the boss, you attack a mass or growth in the middle of his torso, and then the game shows you how much damage you did to him by showing how many of the world rings you managed to knock out of him. The higher your gauge was when you charged the spirit bomb and the higher you were able to keep it while pushing it back, the higher the damage you will inflict. You can knock up to 3 of the world rings out of him at a time, I'm pretty sure at least. All this is accomplished mostly by shaking the Wii Remote. If you want to finish the boss as fast as possible, you will find yourself almost constantly shaking the Wii Remote, which comes with the chance that you could tire yourself out relatively quickly if you are forced to start the fight over again, and continue to utilize that strategy, thus also increasing the chance of player fatigue resulting in diminished performance in the game. I find this meta element of the game just as crucial to the game's intended difficulty of the final boss as the test of the player's command of the gameplay mechanics is. Maybe a lot of people will criticize the motion control's utilization of Sonic and the Secret Rings for this reason, but I couldn't help but to think that this was all part of the boss's design, since the ultimate test of the player's command of the game's mechanics were the fight against the Eraser Djinn and the last couple levels of the game. So I feel it would only make sense that the game's final boss would test a different aspect of the player, and if it's a game centered around motion controls, why not make it a risk versus reward affair where the test is real life endurance? Maybe that kind of kills the accessibility angle of the motion control aspect of the game for a console which built its base on that concept, but I thought its overall approach to the final boss design was really easy to understand and was satisfying to defeat. It's not easy, but it's not unreasonable, despite how ridiculous you might look by shaking the Wii Remote, appearing as though you might be strangling somebody or something. Sonic and the Secret Rings is a beautiful game, as I said before. For a launch title on the Wii, I can't help but to think that this may have been the best looking in terms of its overall presentation, at least in gameplay. Maybe some people don't like the cutscene presentation, but I don't really mind it. Neither here nor there, but I do remember being blown away by the FMV sequences as a kid. Of course, when I first saw them, I didn't know they were videos, but thought instead they were in-engine real-time scenes being rendered by the Wii. But what I will say is that the transition to gameplay graphics from the cutscene graphics is a lot less jarring, if at all, than its HD Big Brother Sonic 06, for whatever that's worth. Sonic and the Secret Rings really is a standout title graphically, and even now it might be one of the best looking third-party games released on the Wii, ever. Maybe Sonic Colors looks a bit better, but with the quality of its visuals, reflections, foliage, particle effects, and even physics, not only on objects but even on Sonic's quills. I'm not sure if there has been a Sonic game released since this one with such an attention to detail. And all this being run on the Wii, which is still referred to by some as little more than an overclocked GameCube, is impressive no matter which way you look at it. There is a strong sense of validation my inner 5th grader feels about finally liking this game. Sonic and the Secret Rings came out at a time when my kid self was excited for the prospect of a next-gen Sonic game. While some might not consider the Wii to be as truly next-gen as something like the Xbox 360 or the PlayStation 3, to me, it was still convincingly next-gen enough for me to be blown away just by the visuals of the screenshots alone. Although it took a long time for me to understand the game and accept the fact that it wasn't going to play like the Sonic games I was used to, I feel now that I can really understand and accept it for what it is. And the experience, while imperfect, is still one that I find worthy of being revisited and enjoyed. Even now, I would be totally okay with going back and clearing all the missions and maybe unlocking all the power-ups and equipping them or trying different configurations just to see how crazy Sonic can be when his full range of abilities are at my disposal. Is there a learning curve? Yes. Is it for everyone? Not likely. Honestly, it's okay to not like this or even hate it. If you disagree with me and have made it this far despite what I've said, your opinion of Sonic and the Secret Rings is still valid. The motion controls really can be off-putting, not just for this game, but for any game, especially on the Wii. I can't blame anyone for having a negative reaction to this game, so even if the fact that it uses motion controls as your stopping point, just know that that isn't an invalid response. When I say I am defending the Indefensible, I mean that in the way that I am defending the game from my own previous disdain for it, despite the fact that it might very well be impossible to defend from criticism and ire of others. Some have said that this is worse than Sonic 06 or Shadow the Hedgehog. Even I have said that in the past. Now I really can't say that based on my own recent experience of the game. But can I really argue against placing it so low? No. Hence, defending the Indefensible. It's highly dependent on the individual's experience, as all games are. But for me, Sonic and the Secret Rings has gone a very long time underappreciated. And I'm finally glad to say that its flaws actually added a further dimension to its gameplay and its experience that I could enjoy. I know I didn't talk much at all about the story, but I felt overall that Shara is a better companion character to Sonic than Princess Elise ever was, and I'm fairly confident that many who even dislike this game can agree to that point, if any at all. But whatever the case may be, in a world where controls for various styles and genres of games have long since been standardized, it's kind of interesting and, dare I say, refreshing to go back to when things weren't so standardized, where control methods were allowed to be more experimental and experience them on their terms. In a way, the meta experience itself offers some level of gameplay variety that lends the game its own identity unique to any other, almost like the immersive arcades of old. Sonic and the Secret Rings is cool, and while yes, it was still a Dark Age game, this level of experimentation was necessary to help create the Sonic we've all come to enjoy in the more recent critically acclaimed titles. And if nothing else, I do believe that this part of its legacy is Sonic and the Secret Rings' greatest success.